So let's get into analysis with Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. So in terms of sort of basic literary elements, this story has some unique characteristics to take note of. One of the first of these is that there is no established time period in the story, and this is one of the reasons, arguably, that it was so contentious when it first came out. Because you learn what happens in the story is that this town is participating in a ritual stoning. And without evidence to the contrary, we typically assume that this story is happening at the time it's written, meaning it would have been happening in 1948. Now, this story is fiction. Of course, this doesn't exist, this village that participates in this doesn't exist. But because of some factors that were going on during that period of time, some people assumed that it did. Some people assumed that this was writing about a real situation or about a contemporary belief or ideology, and certainly was, but this is one of the reasons that it became rather contentious at the time it came out. As well, we start off with this sort of exposition that talks about how the story, they're in the summer, and it talks about this community gathering for the lottery. And a lottery is usually something that we associate with winning something. You don't really win if you're chosen for this lottery, but it intentionally leaves those details ambiguous and sets this up as just sort of a normal sort of civic parade style affair. Now, we learn that Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves are the deliverers of this lottery, and that it is, just sort of this event that happens in the town. Then there's a very important line that happens in the first couple paragraphs, which is the important paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box now resting on the stool had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in the town, was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. So essentially, we know that the lottery has been going on for a long, long, long time. So long that the oldest man in town, it predates him. Right? So this is a long-standing tradition in this town. As well, it is a tradition that people have a lot of sort of reverence for, or a lot of even superstition around, that they feel so strongly about the importance of the lottery that they don't even want to replace the black box. Now, we learn later, of course, that Old Man Warner is 77 and has been participating in the lottery his whole life, which tells us two sort of very important things. Number one, the lottery is older than that. And number two, infants are eligible for the lottery, which once you learn what the lottery is a rather unsettling realization to become aware of. But that reality is also very important to understanding the community that this lottery takes place in. A lot of people read this story and they think, how is nobody questioning this? How is nobody standing up to this idea of the lottery? And the answer is complicated, but also simple. They've been doing this since they were infants. Everybody in the town has been doing this since they were infants. If you notice, when Davy, the son of Tessie, goes up to draw his slip, he has to have help to get, to draw his slip of paper, and then somebody puts pebbles in his hand to throw at his own mother. I mean, if you've grown up in a community where that is happening since birth, there's not really cause to question it in these sort of blindly accepted groupthink mentalities. Now, eventually, our sort of main character, Tessie Hutchinson, enters the scene, and she was so caught up in doing her dishes that she almost forgot that the lottery was taking place. And you notice Bill's already there, her husband is already there. So this isn't even like an event where people would, want to attend with their family. They sort of get worked up and fearful about it, like, what you'd think a ritual sacrifice would be. It's so commonplace to them that she clean almost forgot what day it was. And again, that's just because this is a normal part of their routine. Now, they go through the process of the lottery, and it's important to note the system of the lottery, because once Tessie is chosen, she starts screaming, "It's not fair, it's not fair." And on one hand, a reader sometimes assumes, well, it's a random chance. Like, you're just saying it's not fair because you don't want to get stoned. But there's complications to that, right? So the system of the lottery is that the man of the household draws for the whole family. And then the slip, or the family that gets selected, draws again to select what member of that family is going to be on the chopping block. No pun intended. And in this system, the reason that Tessie is chosen is because, Bill chose their slip first. She's not in control of whether her family gets picked. And so the question of fairness is something that's rather interesting to consider if you think about the way that this lottery system actually works. When we get into some more complex interpretations of this story later on in the research process and research skills components, a lot of the research points to this story as a sort of example of gender inequality in a certain sort of way. Tessie is a very sort of domestic housewife. She's not in control of who draws her slip. She's not in control of what happens to her in that situation. And in the 1940s, that would have been very timely for a writer, especially a writer like Shirley Jackson, to be commenting on. Now, one of the questions that you might have and that many readers have when they read the story is, why are they doing this? What is the purpose of the lottery? Why is this something that the town does? And just like this lottery has taken place for longer than anybody can remember, the reasons behind the lottery go back to before people can remember. So later on in the story, Old Man Warner talks about a pack of crazy fools when Mr. and Mrs. Adams mention that other towns are getting rid of their lottery. And Old Man Warner says, they're crazy. There used to be a saying in town, lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. He says there used to be a saying about that. So ostensibly, maybe this was created as some sort of sacrifice for agriculture or sacrifice for good crops. But even Old Man Warner, 77 years old, says that used to be the saying. Now we don't even really know why we're doing it. And this idea that something bad will happen if they get rid of the lottery is so deeply entrenched that nobody even really has cause to question if there was a reason for it. Now, this sort of premise reminds me of a little wives' tale that you might find interesting. And the story goes that a woman gets married and learns how to make bread from her mother. And her mother makes the loaf of bread and cuts off the last third of the loaf before she puts it in the oven. And her daughter says, "Why do you do that?" And she says, "Well, that's the way that my mother taught me." And then she goes to her grandma, and her grandma does the same thing. She makes the loaf of bread, she cuts off the last third of it, and well, why do you do that? She says, "Well, that's the way my mother taught me." And so then she goes to her great-grandmother, who does the same thing, and or she says, why do you cut off the last third of the loaf of bread? And the great-great-grandmother says, "Well, my oven was so small that it wouldn't fit in otherwise." So you see, they've been taught this thing that doesn't even apply anymore, but they keep doing it because nobody wants to question it. And this is essentially what's happening to the lottery times a great deal, right? It's a lot more severe than that. You also want to notice in terms of character, the different characterization or how the interactions between the characters tell us about them. This is another story like Hills Like White Elephants, where we have a third-person objective narrator. We're in nobody's mind. So we have to go based on what we know in the narration and what we know about the characters. And you notice Bill and Tessie, the husband and wife, didn't go to the lottery together. And when Tessie is chosen and she starts protesting, Bill tells her, word for word, "Shut up, Tessie." So he tells her to sort of stop protesting, like she's making a scene or embarrassing him. So the sort of dynamic between husband and wife, or dynamic between people who are in a relationship, is really interesting there as well. Tessie tries to have her daughter, who is married to another person, put into her family's drawing to lessen her chances of getting drawn. And that's a kind of a wild thing, if you think about it, what this tradition has done to sort of basic human hierarchy or basic human dynamics in the story. She is a mother willing to sacrifice her own daughter to save herself. And that likely comes from the fact that this idea of sacrifice has gone on for so long that bonds between mother and child or parent and child are a lot different, and it is normal for a parent or a sibling or a relative to prefer one of their family members to be sacrificed rather than the other way around. And then we discover, of course, in the final paragraphs of the story that what the lottery is that they are going to stone her to death. And she protests about it being fair. It's not fair. It's not right. Nobody listens. In fact, her friend tells her to be a good sport about it. And, the iconic last line, and then they were upon her. It doesn't really, she meets her fate, so to speak. Now, in terms of analysis and interpretation, there's a lot to unpack in this story, but for our purposes, the generally accepted theme in this story is about blind obedience to tradition and about mob mentality or groupthink. This town is all able to do this thing because nobody questions it. They're just sort of going along with what everybody in town thinks as well. They're adhering to this tradition without any knowledge of where it came from or why they do it or any question towards that tradition. This is also a great example, though, of some important things to note as we get into literary analysis that you want to be aware of. Number one, the difference between theme and moral. There is no moral to this story. There is no lesson to this story. As with much literature, there is not. And moral or lesson is what a lot of students tend to want to find. You want to find the happy ending or the what are we supposed to learn from it? We're not supposed to learn anything from this. Not in terms of morality. There's nobody in this story we want to emulate. There's nothing about this town that is good. Instead, you want to look at theme. And what this story is doing is exploring the danger of blind tradition and the extent to which the human capacity for violence, essentially, when you're in that sort of scope of tradition and adherence to what everybody else around you is doing. And the point that's being made about that, the observation about human life, is simply the tendency for people to go along with that rather than any sort of lesson like people should or shouldn't, do that. And arguably, this is another reason why the story was so controversial when it first came out. Because when it first came out was on the heels of the Holocaust, it was on the heels of World War II, it was during the Red Scare. There was a lot of fear and group mentality and adherence to tradition going on. And, many people felt disquieted by this because it maybe looked a little bit too real or seemed a little bit too possible than it should. As well, this is a great example of how you want to avoid the, sort of positive ending. There's no sort of positive, inspirational way to spin this story. She gets stoned to death. That's it. And this is something to be mindful of when you are performing your own analysis. Kurt Vonnegut famously said that all great literature is about what a bummer it is to be a human. But isn't it nice to hear somebody say that? So, although, there are some sort of validating or empathetic things that can come out of it, there's no uplifting positive end to this story. So instead of looking at what is the message, we're looking at, what is it saying? And another thing that you want to be very mindful of in this story is your personal reaction versus your critical interpretation, right? We read this story as modern, decent people and think, of course, everybody in town would want to change this, or there would be people who would not want to do this. Like, there has to be somebody who is aware of the immorality of this. But in reality, there's nothing about the story that leads us to believe that that's the case. As a matter of fact, everybody seems pretty nonchalant about it. And that leads us to a sort of additional theme to consider as we work with this story over the next couple of weeks, is that Tessie has no problem with the lottery until it affects her. And another observation that the story may be making is how willing people are to accept horrifying things until they affect them. Now, we will get into this story much deeper as you work through your research project to unpack the different ways that you can use literary analysis and use research to explore these sorts of things. But I'm looking forward to seeing what you all think in the comments and what your initial reaction is to the iconic lottery.